super curious about like the oh shoot, let me get rid of that. All right, give me just a second to tweet this out and then we will go. Awesome. So yeah, I've got a bunch of questions here, but first let's talk about dividends. So I think one of the most interesting things about what you've done with Gumroad, and we, may not have enough time to dive into the entire story, but it started out with the intent of being yet another multi-billion-dollar VC-backed company. Somewhere along the way, realized, hey, this isn't working quite in that general path. And we can, the story behind that is fascinating. But then turned it into a quasi bootstrapped company, which is a jujitsu move that's impressive. And then now uh, you do public board meetings, which is another interesting. And you do this very differently than most people. You're playing this game very differently than the average Silicon Valley backed founder. Um, and now you are looking at dividends, which is a word that venture capital people are not used to, which is paying, you know, theoretically the way that most companies work is a company makes a bunch of money and then it distributes that money to the shareholders. Um, Normally in VC land, that's not a thing. You just make the money and stash it, and then the stock is the real product, so to speak, for the investors. Um, but how? Tell me about the discovery of even what do you do when you, as a venture backed company, start trying to pay dividends? Because it doesn't seem like there's even an ecosystem to support that. Like I've never heard of that happening before at any like Delaware C Corp style company, you know?
Yeah, certainly not a private one, right? When you go public,
Right.
there's departments, grant departments, and things that do this for you. But um, yeah, there's really no precedent. One of our investors, he told me as we were working through this, he said, since he's been investing since 2004, and this is like a Silicon Valley based tier one VC, this is the first distribution they're ever going to get from an investment. And they've done very well. It's just to your point, the vast majority, basically, up until this dividend, basically 100% of these sort of the returns is you sell, as you said, you acquire the stock for a price and then you sell that stock later on to another buyer uh, for a higher price, right? And this is normal if even for VC companies, they just do it after the IPO, and then there's sort of infrastructure to do that. You can sort of give Schwab or Vanguard a bunch of money, and then they distribute it sort of on your behalf, right? But yeah, we kind of came to this point where I was like, well, I want to it seems possible if you actually look at the incorporation document, right, of any Delaware-based C corp, the first thing in there is actually a dividend. I mean, that's why you set up the
That's the
that's why
point of
it's a
the
C
company
corp.
theoretically, right? We've abstracted that away so much that you don't even it's not even a thing, but that should be the point, so to speak.
Exactly. I mean, imagine investing in a company and not actually looking at the charter. It basically means you don't actually know what rights you have as an investor to receiving dividends. Which again, that sort of we've abstracted that away, and we're sort of long-term people, players playing long-term games, and so you can kind of abstract away. There's a very high trust environment. I think
There were many
people
layers of
kind of
abstraction beyond that at this point. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And so yeah, I was like, okay, I want to do this. It seems possible. How do we actually go out and do it? And we basically got quoted, basically, in the six figures, 100, $200,000 a year from like PwC, like banks,
I was
effectively,
gonna say,
right?
who do you even go to? You actually go to a bank and say, "Hey, I would like to distribute profits to my shareholders, and I'm a privately held company. Can you help us do that?" And they say, "Yeah, theoretically, but it's going to be expensive."
Exactly. It's going to cost, let's say $25 per shareholder, and you have 7,000 shareholders. And by the way, 2,500 of them are not based in the US. and so you have to withhold taxes for them. This is sort of like, it feels like raising money before the safe, or raising money before AngelList, right? Where you're
Yeah.
like, it's going to cost you a bunch of money. You're going to work with a bank. The way you work with that bank is through with a lawyer, and that lawyer is charging you tens of thousands of dollars to do this. And so basically we had to do it ourselves, and that's kind of what we decided to do. And I remember like thinking like, okay, I really like, I want to do this dividend. It's legally sort of possible. There are two bottlenecks. One is the sort of, can we actually execute on it, and then the other one was, will our investors allow us to do it? We got through that one. And then we'd been building this product concurrently with Gumroad in the last year called Flexile, which is like this basically deal light, for small companies like Gumroad that are like basically async, fully, part-time employees, et cetera. We wanted like a solution for that. And I basically was like, well, it seems stupid. It seems kind of dumb to say we're going to build a company that, for like with one customer in mind. But it also feels similar to the reasons I built Gumroad, the reason I built Flexile, which is there's this weird new thing that's happening. The internet is enabling also these new regulations like Reg CF. Like maybe there's going to be more of these in the future. And if we're the first, we may have to like lay our own path. But then maybe there will be other companies who are like, oh, I didn't even realize like you could do this. Like, what if it wasn't $100,000 to issue dividends? Like, what if a coffee shop could issue dividends to its shareholders? And I think the simple like idea here is basically what happens when you drop the price of being a public company by 100x or 1,000x. Because
Mm.
effectively, you can do all this. You just have to go public, and it costs, about, I've been quoted from Goldman about $250,000 to $500,000 a year to be a public company. Just the
Just
CFO
the
you need, the lawyers you need,
regulatory, the
reporting.
investor relations, checking the box.
Exactly. And that doesn't include, like all the stuff that you don't really think about that can go wrong, right? That you're now sort of now liable for.
Right.
You can get sued, you're a public company, you can get sued, like Business Insider is going to write stuff about you, what you did 10 years ago, all this kind of stuff. But yeah, what if you get rid of that and you say, actually, there's now SaaS, just like AngelList with rolling funds or something that makes it super simple and easy. And it's just like you type in some stuff and you have a company and you connect it, and you can like add, you can take a CSV and you can add people and you can pay people. And in theory, it sort of seems possible. We're issuing our first dividend next week. July 1st is the goal. And so we'll kind of see if it works, if it happens. But again, it's literally like the first paragraph in our charter. So it sort of feels right. The other thing here, the other sort of, and this is something I haven't talked about publicly, but the other tension here is that basically the liability here is insane,
That's what I was
right?
going to ask.
Basically, if
Is like,
you're,
what, you say, yeah, I hope we'll issue a dividend on July 1st, and like, I mean, immediately so many questions about what if, and full disclosure, I am a tiny microscopic shareholder in Gumroad. I signed up for the dividend not because I care about the money that's coming. I just think it's fascinating experiment to be a part of. So don't worry, I'm not suing anybody. The disclosure on the other side, I think you're a tiny investor in Bloom Tech from way back in the day.
yeah,
But what if like the edge cases make my brain explode? What if someone doesn't go put in their bank account information? Do you just store it and wait for them, or do they lose the opportunity to receive a dividend? How does that even work?
yeah, like what if they're Russian, right? And they're currently
Right.
sanctioned. There's basically the way, and to be honest, this is what lawyers do, right? Lawyers, their job is, the reason lawyers exist and the reason you can't chat GPT everything is because there is a lot of like, it's fuzzy, right? There's like some precedents
Yep.
over here and this state, and then this thing happened over here, and you're kind of like, this happened with eggs that like kind of resembles like what you're doing, like that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But basically, there is no precedence. I mean, the truth is, no one has ever done this. We will be the first, and the way precedence gets set is kind of in this way, where I think you do it, and then you kind of just like, and the reason I run Gumroad so openly, like so transparently, public board meetings, all this stuff, is because I like it will force me to do things correctly and in the best possible way,
Mm,
right? Like I'm not doing the SBF style. Like I'm like, you can look at the, everything is public, because I think this is honestly the hardest thing I've ever done, because it's sort of constrained by what the government wants me to do, right? Like with Gumroad, I can just build whatever, with Flex,
sure.
it's not a big deal. But in this case, for example, the IRS is like, this is what you have to do. in the case of Russia, or this is the, it's just that you have to do it at scale with 7,000 people, right? Um, and so,
Well, it
yeah,
is
we're just kind
interesting because like the legal it's a case where so I've operated a lot in instances where there is no legal groundwork. And I mean, you look at Coinbase and the SEC and they're saying, "Hey, what should we do?" And the SEC is like, "Follow the law." And they're like, "We don't know how." This isn't that necessarily. They're like it's well documented, just nobody well, there may be parts of it that aren't well documented, but nobody does it. So,
Yeah, the
um
biggest thing I would say that's sort of undocumented is basically there's two things. One is that there are a lot of unaccredited investors, and basically
Yeah, I was
because of
gonna say there's a
CF or
KYC process, accreditation. Yeah,
so there's a little bit there, and then there's really just like, yeah, can you actually like, do you believe that the IRS will not be annoying, right? Like, what, let's say you accidentally do something incorrectly and you withhold too little or too much, and then like, 7 years go by and the IRS is like, hey, you owe us like $80,000 or something like that, right? Like, to me, that's sort of like the extent of what will maybe happen, right? And but it's sort of one of those things where I think the most likely scenario, the one we're hoping for, is that 10 years go by, we issue, tens of millions of dollars worth of dividends, and it's a nothing burger effectively. And I find this is similar with Gumroad too, in that sometimes product market fit is just not dying. And then people are just like, oh, it must be fine, right? Like, it's just like
yeah.
Gumroad, a year into it, people are like, oh, this is like crazy. What about fraud? What about this? And then like 3 years in, no one has those questions anymore. It's similar to pricing, I find too. It's like you increase your pricing, everyone freaks out, and then 3 months later, inherently everyone's still paying. So like it must be worth it, right? Like you're sort
Which
of
I definitely
proving
want
the
to talk
value.
about pricing, but
Yeah.
before we move on to that, how do you calculate the risk of the liability in this? Because the downside of the upside of the U.S. legal system is a lot of the times you kind of just do what you think is right and you try to stay within the lines. And then eventually there's a giant court case where somebody gets sued for a massive amount of money, and then it goes to court, and then there's a decision made, and then that gives everybody else the guidelines of like, okay, that's how it works. Um, theoretically, I think. Look, the reality is, kind of like the best security is just being obscure. Like, if you're issuing 50-cent dividends, no one's gonna like lawyer up, right? I don't even know what is the size of the dividend approximately that you're issuing.
Yeah, I would say the average person is getting about $60.
Okay, so it's not zero, but it's definitely not. It's not worth an hour of a lawyer's time on average, we'll say.
Exactly.
So for now seems very likely that it goes off without a hitch. How do you? But you're also setting a precedent for yourself of continuing to issue those. And I don't know that you have to like commit that we're always going to issue dividends, but the cultural expectation of a shareholder would be that they make profit and then they pay us out in profit. How did you think about the liability in that instance?
Yeah, so we actually ended up updating our charter. And so the Gumroad charter now says that up to 60% of net income for the last 12 months preceding, we can issue a dividend. So what that means is that I no longer have to go to preferred shareholders to issue a dividend up to 60%, which also implies to investors now going forward that we will issue around, like in a sort of a default case, we plan to issue a 60% net income dividend every year. The way I think about it is it's basically like running with a weighted vest, right? Where we basically have to be profitable enough, lean enough to be able to continue to build Gumroad, to continue to build Flexile. We have other products that we're shipping. We have this customer support tool that uses AI that is amazing, that we've been building in house that we hope to launch later this year. And yeah, it's sort of saying like we are able to do all of these things because of the way that we've constructed the company in this very unique way, and it becomes a sales pitch for Flexile, right? It sort of becomes a sales pitch because at the end of the day, and to your point around liability, like why do this, right? If you think about, sorry, there's a cat. If you think about Airbnb or Uber, like why were those the companies that decided to like deal with the regulation of the hotel industry or the taxi? It's like because the opportunity became worthwhile, and it's like if you do, you build $100 billion company, right? You unlock this massive opportunity. And the thing is, before Uber, you look at cabs and you're like, like who need this? Like get a car or like whatever. There's buses. And then after Airbnb, you're like, holy crap! Like every other house should be sort of like a collaborative space. They're like the doors
Yeah,
open
what
up.
percentage of houses
Um,
are sitting empty at any given time? Someone should monetize, like there's a coordination problem. If I have an empty house, you need somewhere to stay,
yeah,
like let's just,
exactly. And if you think about like to your point, like there's this massive product which is the stock, right? This stock that VCs buy and sell, and that like imagine how much stock is just sitting on a shelf, right? Metaphorically, in like someone's house, and it's worth insane amounts of money. It's like a box that just prints money. Like that's what a stock is. It's just like it's a
Mhm.
money printer, right? It's like, oh, it's like a piggy bank that just like churns cash, right? In Gumroad's case, it's a piggy bank that churns about $10 million a year, right? So how much, you talk about this on Twitter all the time, like how many tech companies, software companies are there that are just churning out, like how do the average American gets rich through dividends, right? It's just through they own a business that car dealership pays out millions of dollars a year, and they get some chunk of that. Uh, and so it's kind of like the default way that most people, like most rich people, get rich. But it's sort of the way that most people think about stock is like owning Apple stock or owning Google stock. By the time these companies get there, they're worth insane amounts of money. Certainly that wasn't true for those companies, but now with tech companies it is. And so what if you just get rid of the IPO and say, hey, actually, like once you're profitable, I actually think about this, like, I ask myself this all the time, like, why hasn't anyone done this, right? Like, why not? Once you're a YC company, you raise 500K, you're Zapier or Weebly or something, you're making millions and millions of dollars. Why don't you just start issuing dividends? I think the reason is that basically, as soon as you raise a single dollar of preferred shares, right, you're locked in.
Yep.
You're locked into effectively, these people are now in at a price and a valuation. And Gumroad got lucky because in
Explain that for people
2020,
who don't. So yeah, um, don't need to explain all of preference, but like, why is that the case?
yeah, so as we've talked about, like part of a charter is a dividend right that common stockholders get, and what defines preferred, which is what every investor will get, and the reason that they will never want to own common, because what it means is if you own common, imagine like YC was like, we'll take a million for 10%. They could get you could just cash out the million and take 90% because you own 90% of the company, right? And so the preference has two things. One is for any dividend that there's two things. One is the dividend piece that no one talks about because it's not important, which is anytime there's a dividend issued to common, it should also get issued to preferred, right? That's the right. And then the right that everyone knows about, which is basically this liquidation preference, which is if the company sells for less than the money you raise, all the money goes back to investors, right? But both of these things effectively allow preferred to block all dividends, right? It
Hmm.
means you need permission, not just board consent, but also, and this
Shareholder
makes
permission
shareholder consent, because you're effectively taking money that they've
out
invested
of the
prior,
company.
or even if
Yeah.
it's retained earnings, but you're effectively sort of like skipping the line, and so anyway, like it's possible, it's doable. It's just like I had to call every single investor, right? I had to go for a nice long walk with Naval and be like, hey, this is what we're doing. Like, what do you think? And he was like, seems cool, interesting, kind of like rolling funds, right? Like that sort of thing. But it's just honestly, I think it's not that hard. It's just that the incentives haven't lined up for anybody else to do it, right? Like a CEO that owns 7% of the company and he raised like $8 million and is at like 4 million ARR. Like Gumroad is just kind of in this like weird, unique place where we're kind of like bootstrapped, we're kind of venture funded. We also have the capital, like the software engineering talent to actually build the SaaS, right?
Right.
Like we have enough profitability to actually say we're going to dedicate like two or three people to actually building all this stuff, and we have the domain experience of. I remember like the bank was like, are you sure you want to do this yourself? Like I don't think that's possible. I don't think you can do it. Like
Yeah.
legally, I don't think.
Payments are
I asked
nasty. You don't. Yeah.
ChatGPT. They say that it's I can. I'm like I'm pretty sure if you're like running a bakery, you don't need to work with a bank, right? Um, but yeah, I was like, well, I've done. They're like, you're going to issue 7,000 checks to all over the world. That's what you're telling me you're going to do by yourself. By the way, you don't even have any full time employees. Like, how are you? Like, what are you even talking about? And I'm like, well, actually, with Gumroad, like, we issue 30,000 checks. Like,
Right.
we already do this. We literally already do this, and we tell the IRS, right? We have to tell the IRS like via 1099s, which we also have to do with dividends. So in theory,
Hmm.
we've like kind of built this. It's
So you're
just
riding the
for
same rails that already exist for part of it, at least.
100%. I mean, the UI is kind of similar. Like, there's a lot of similarities, and I think this is like I think about like Elon often because I think he's sort of someone who started a company, found success, and then kept starting companies. And so I think about that because there's not that many examples. But I find it interesting that like they're sort of similar, right? Like he often starts companies in similar ways, or the companies themselves look similarly. Like he's never like properly founded a company. There's always like some weird like thing that like merge in PayPal's case,
There's
or
like a
maybe
tie-in from something he has in the past, or he's a spin-off of.
exactly. And I think
Basically,
in
been
my
like
case, I'm
straight
always
up.
finding like weird like kind of like finding some arbitrage and like Gumroad is not that hard to build. Flexile is not that complicated, right? Like it's just that there feels like a gap in the market that's just starting to get hot. There's sort of this democratization of like, yeah, what happens when you take something that really only like you used to hire basically software engineers to do, whether it's
Right.
sell a product on the internet or issue dividends or whatnot. And yeah, what if you and Gumroad is just massively constrained by the fact that I literally have no full-time employees. So like the only way we can do anything is if the software engineers build SaaS, and so it's kind of a nice constraint. It sort of forces us to build software, right? Instead of just
Yeah.
like
Instead of having a
kind of
bunch, I mean,
hire somebody
I've been
in.
on the other side of that where things that could be software, you end up hiring operations people for, and then they create more processes, and then it becomes really difficult to, for as an example, for us taking attendance became extremely expensive. Like tens of
Mm.
thousands of dollars a week were being spent on taking attendance. And it's like, well, it's the most obvious thing that any school should be able to do online. Like everyone's sitting at a computer, there are APIs all over the place, but we taken attendance in such a way that it wasn't easily replicable by via API, and like this API doesn't have the right data here and that API doesn't have the right data there, and we had to kind of like throw out our model for attendance taking and start over, and then it was like, oh, that was actually super simple. So I love I think the idea, the constraint of doing everything via software is actually really healthy. In fact, one of the more powerful mental models that I've ever encountered was someone who was used to kind of service based businesses, and he talked about how everything that he sees a company do is either a data structure or an algorithm. So in other words, it's either some set of information organized in some way sitting there, or it's an algorithm, which is a way you're moving that data around. And so, sometimes our algorithms are far too, if it's just a human, your algorithm can be like using your best judgment at the time. But they try to basically document everything in the same way a software engineer would. And then it becomes really easy to use software where you can or should use software. So it's a really interesting constraint, although they they don't have the combined constraint of having only part-time employees, which I'm curious. Um, I still have a bunch of stuff I want to ask you about that, but it might be a good segue into. I mean, you can't just brush upon that and then not dig a little bit. Um, so talking about Gumroad setup, zero full-time employees. I think we would agree. Even yourself, you're not 40 hours a week on Gumroad. Um, the theory behind it is, decoupling the work that somebody does from 40 hours a week. Most people aren't working 40 hours a week anyway. They're either working more or less, and salary kind of lumps it all together and averages it and whatever else. Um, but why did you decide to, like, everybody has that thought experiment of, I feel like you've taken a bunch of like things that have been curious over the years, and people are like, oh, that is interesting. Why doesn't anybody do that? And then the incentive isn't there to actually do it, so everybody just goes, the default path and decides to take on other risks. But why did you decide to actually go to a part-time workforce? And do you actually think it's better generally, or is it just a little bit quirky and better for you, and it works well enough? Don't not worth correcting back the other way.
Yeah, I mean, I think about it a lot. I think I'm not a huge I'm not anti the office necessarily, but I do think that the vast majority of work is just blood, sweat, and tears. honestly. Like building a really great product is often like you kind of know what you need to do. You have the design specced out in Figma, let's say, and you're just like building the thing. Uh, and I think if your job is like that, not every job is like that, right? But I think a lot of jobs are. And certainly almost with AI, to your point, if you're able to kind of like automate a lot of the data structure algorithms piece, like what ends up being the remainder of the work is the like the last mile bit. It's like talking to the customer, it's sales, it's marketing. That stuff will still exist, but all the middle stuff in the organization is gone. And that's kind of like, the reason I started it with part time was I had to. I was basically Gumroad was running out of money, um, and I was running out of energy, and so I didn't really want to think about it. I had sort of at that point, we failed to raise the Series B. We downsized from 20 full time people to just me. There were two engineers who were helping me transition. They sort of pieced out, and then I basically like as I started, I was doing everything myself, like fixing bugs, doing support. And then with support, I was like, hey, Steve, the guy who was doing support for us before, who still does support, literally in 2023, still does support for us in this way, hourly contract. Hey, can you do this? I can't do this anymore. Uh, and then I was like, basically like, why not? Like, why go back? I don't have an office. Like, I'm moving to Provo, taking a class with Brandon Sanderson. I want to do that. I don't want meetings like popping up in the middle of the day, like a Zoom meeting, like just like, ruining my productivity. Uh, and so I just kind of kept going. And I just honestly, like, I think the Gumroad story, like, just showed me that, like, our growth is not really determinant on even, frankly, the amount of work happening, right? Like, literally zero work could be happening at Gumroad and Gumroad will still go. It's not even a question of, like, are
Mm.
people working or not? It's like, even if they were, right, it doesn't really matter. And so it's kind of like, how do you build a company with that in mind, right? Where you're like work doesn't need to happen. Some people want to work, but like I don't right? Like don't force me to work if you want to work, right?
Yeah.
And this is honestly something I felt like when I looked back at Gumroad, like one of the things I always struggled with was like this sort of it was hard. It was binary. You're either bought in or not to the company. It was like joining a cult or something, right? And it felt like that leaving sometimes, right? And like you get equity, you get stock, you get your friends, you get your social life, you get the office that you hang out, you get all of these things. Um, but also like you get like you're forced to work with all these other people, and you're like, this person doesn't work that hard. I work way harder, but it's like, but I also I'm single, so I get that they're busy with kids, but it's not fair. But they get equity, but my equity is based on their work. But all this stuff that I just felt like I just want to just ship product. Like I just want to come in, do some work because it's fun, and leave and get paid if it's worthwhile. And so anyway, that's kind of like the way I modeled Gumroad was like, what if we stop pretending? Or not that everybody's pretending, but I do think like a lot of people just want to do some work. They're really amazing software engineer. They want to clock in and clock out. They want to do 4 hours a day or 2 hours a day or 7 hours a day or whatever, maybe 8 hours a day. But they generally want to do the work and leave. And I think this is almost everybody, to be honest. I think when you run a company, you get to pick what you work on. You get to pick who you work with. Like you're a VC, you get to pick who you invest. All that stuff. It's a little different. But if you're like, a software engineer or designer, like you're generally just like it's a job, right? And so I just kind of wanted to push on that. Like what happens when you just like admit that like people are here just to work, just to get paid, and there's no pretend. And my, I don't know if it's better. I don't know if it's necessarily like, and I certainly like the way Apple works, right? Like certainly, like I wouldn't say build a Vision Pro this way, but I think if you're building a pure software product, if you kind of know what the work is most of the time, where you're not like needing to sync like every 3 hours something changes. Like if you're building some LLM thing, sure, like go in the office, right? But
Right.
Gumroad's like 12 years old, it's profitable. Like when people say you can't build products this way, you can't build new products or have ideas. Like I really disagree with the hallway conversation thing personally, because I really believe the best products are just one guy's vision, right? Just like one
Mm.
person in a room. And the hallway conversations are basically being like, why the hell isn't this done this way? That's what the hallway
Sure.
conversation is. It's a one way CEO of the company enforcing the vision on the rest of the company, which is fine. It's just that's like, I feel like it's the hallway conversation, like serendipity. Like people are like, oh, Apple wanted. I'm like, dude, Apple was like dictatorship. Like it was not about like, it
Yeah,
was
they
about
literally have
Steve.
secret rooms where you can't talk cross functionally.
Exactly. It's just,
It's
and
kind
at the
of
end of
really
the
funny
day,
to be like, yeah, they just wanted to like have the maximum amount of like spontaneous. meeting where you can't tell anybody what you're doing or you get fired immediately.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
want creative. Yeah, and that's why no one at Apple even knew the Vision Pro was coming out until it did, right? Like, yeah,
Yeah.
sure. I know what it is it's just incentives, and getting people into an office probably does make certain people work more, gets them focused more, especially if the job's like not that fun, or you really need people to kind of, like the middle management piece that you have to train, and like, yeah, I get all of that stuff. But I personally think it's going to be like college. You're going to go to an office for 3 or 4 years, just like you move to a city for 3 or 4 years. You get trained, you learn the skills, you meet everybody, and then maybe you kind of do reunions every 6 months, every year. You have those hallway conversations if and when you need them. They're super dense. But I honestly feel like like I don't need, even like with Gumroad being in an office, I'm like, I need to talk to somebody. I'm gonna go call a creator, or I'm gonna call this founder
Yeah.
friend of mine. Like, it's not in office like that sort of thing. That thing was like getting people to work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. It's amazing for that. And when you're paying someone a bulk salary, I get it. You want to get more hours per. I don't think Google was that sophisticated. They're like, dinner pays for 2 extra hours of engineers who come in at 11.
Oh, the
Deal.
math on that is ridiculous, right? Like
Easy.
yeah.
Yeah,
Some
it's
CFO was like, dude, these perks cost us like this. And if we were to bump everybody's salary 10K a year, it costs us this. Like, yeah, give
Yeah,
whatever
but I
beanbags
think
you
what
want. Give
happens is
it.
people, it works one time. It's like swag works for t-shirts, where it's like $10 and it's like a billboard everywhere. But it's like, or it's like your first $50 you spend on Instagram ads. You're like, this is amazing. I could build $1 billion company doing this. But you're tapping out of the best resource there is, and then and I think it's a lot of that where, it's just the t-shirt is really good swag, and then it turns out like all the other stuff is like actually not that valuable to do. Getting people in the office for dinner probably does add a lot, and then all the other stuff, I think cargo was mostly a cargo cult, sort of like, oh yeah, it seems like to work, it doesn't, it doesn't hurt, but like the vast majority of it is and Gumroad is just the null hypothesis, right? It's just like, what if you just get rid of everything else?
I
And
was
I
gonna say
just
it feels like you think a lot about not necessarily waste, but like what is the and I'm sure you've thought about this more so you can describe it more elegantly. Like what is the de facto status quo that people pull off the shelf and accept without questioning? And
yeah,
like yeah, and then you have gone through and kind of poked holes in all of those assumptions and found that they're far more dotted lines than they are solid lines, and you can kind of do whatever you want, really. Like that's it's been
yeah,
fascinating to watch that as a journey.
totally. Like, for example, I had a conversation with someone last week, and he runs like a property management company. Maybe 100 full-time employees. Uh, that go clean and lock doors and do all that kind of stuff. And he's like, how do you run Gumroad? How do you do customer support? I'm like, oh, we have customer support like anywhere in the world. This kind of model. We pay people $75 an hour. And he was like, what? $75 an hour to do what? And like, just to answer email, like, customer support, like
That's a classic
anyone.
Silicon Valley. Like, wait, there are people who make less than 80. Like, and everyone's like, are you like,
I know,
I
yeah, exactly.
I grind
75
for
bucks an
80
hour.
hours a week in a dirty kitchen to make 50.
You could do
Uh,
this if you're 13 years old and you know how Gumroad works, right? You don't need a degree. You don't need anything. And if you do the math on what this is, if you do it 35 hours a week, 40, 50 weeks a year, it's about 100 grand. It's about
yeah.
120 grand, right? So you can make six figures doing this. And but he was hiring people in the Philippines at $5 an hour, and so he needed hundreds of people. Like, he needed way more people, and he was. I think it was just like
So his
I'm
scale, he
like,
was like, "You're crazy. That would bankrupt us."
exactly. But my thinking is, if I can pay triple or more, maybe, 10x, let's say, what if that means I need one person instead of 100 people, right? Like, what if? And I think that what if is yes for me. Like, it's the software. It's like, I believe software will lead to a yes. Maybe not today, but like, for example, I think customer support at Gumroad could be one person an hour a day with existing software. We can't do that yet. It requires 5 part-time people currently. So maybe it's about 20 to 30 hours of work a day. But I think we could do a 20x return on investment with software implementing just our roadmap over the next four
Is
months.
that because of AIs and LLMs and whatever else, or is that just okay? Yeah,
It's
I totally
mostly
buy that.
it's just
I
it's a
totally buy that.
combination of other stuff, which is just like keyboard shortcuts, like, basic things like superhuman-esque interaction. And then, yeah, just building like a custom LLM workflow for basically the top, basically 90-95% of Gumroad inbound. And then automating all of the actual, and this is what we're working on now. We can answer all the tickets almost perfectly well, but actually being able to take action. So imagine you email Gumroad and you're like, hey, I bought this thing, yesterday. I want a refund. Um,
To be able to say,
basic
okay, here, refund, boom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, we saw that this refund, this the product you bought has a refund policy of like 48 hours. We see your purchase was within that. So we've gone ahead and refunded the purchase. Like, let me know if you have any other questions, like, best uh Sahil and and like imagine doing that currently would take about 3 minutes, right? Because you're like click a link, like the dashboard opens, you hit refund, you type in the response. Uh Now it takes 1 second, right? Like three
Yeah.
minutes to that's about 180x, right? Speed improvement on that one ticket. And so it's just like the Elon, like what happens when you make a rocket reusable, right? Like what happens
Right.
when you answer one ticket and it answers that ticket for the rest of the company's life? How many tickets do you need to answer until you've answered all tickets? Probably like a few hundred, maybe, you know?
Well, I'm sure there's a
Um,
Pareto in the tickets as well. I mean, I can, I look at Bloom Tech support.
yeah,
80% of it is literally the same question, right?
yeah,
And then the next 10% is a subset of the next 20 questions. And then the long tail is really long and nasty, but
yeah,
you get to 80/20 really
yeah.
easily. What I think AI lets us do is handle all the edge cases elegantly with little cost. Um,
Yeah, at the end of the day, you still have like I still believe in the human, right? Like I just
Mhm.
believe that human is now getting paid like $300 an hour because they can now do like all Gumroad support, like Ozymandias from Watchmen or something, right? Like you're just
right.
like approving. Like one thing we're gonna do is we can effectively group like to your point, every answer, like there's like 10 tickets that are all kind of similar, but they're all from people with different names, right?
Mhm.
What if you could automate answering all 10 of those in the same way but slightly different each time, but you only have to hit reply one time, right?
Yeah.
um,
Have you used
and I
Superhuman
think
AI
this is
yet?
like totally doable. Sorry.
Have you used Superhuman AI yet?
No, I haven't. I don't use super. I use hey.com. So
Okay. Yeah, it's just fascinating that for me it was just a realization, when I first got Superhuman, which, I was like, "Oh, there's keyboard shortcuts." And then everyone else is like, "Yeah, Gmail has that already." And I was like, "Oh, I wonder how much of Superhuman's like early adoption was like the fact that they educated people on you can use keyboard shortcuts for
yeah,
email." I don't know what it
it
was, but I'm sure it wasn't zero. And obviously the product is optimized for that, but um,
yeah,
you know, they literally spent hundreds of hours teaching people how to get through email more quickly, right? Um, and then the next level of that is, Superhuman AI is starting to, and I'm not an investor in Superhuman, just a user, whatever. Um, but I wonder how much time I've spent rewriting the same email that's 90% the same. You could use snippets before. You could, have stuff that's easy, but that last 10% is massive. And
yeah,
it feels like that's the first approach of a lot of AI products is going to be, hey, we're going to go from, 80% automatable to 98% automatable,
yeah,
right? You guys are building a product that uses AI to do support, are you not?
yeah. Exactly right. Yeah, I mean, basically, I
Do
think
you know
it's
what
it's
the
very
actual
similar.
percentage is of what the AI could handle? Like, what metrics do you track, if any, along how good it is or how well it works?
Yeah, I mean, basically, we track how many times the draft is used, which is like over 50% probably now.
Hmm.
It started at like 20%. We got it up to 40% by using past responses in the embeddings in the prompt using embeddings. Then we started including information from the Gumroad database. And so, for example, you email from your email will get your purchase history, your account history, the status of your bank account, the status of your payments, etc. Um, I th- I I think by the end of the quarter we'll probably get it up to about 80%. Um, but honestly, I haven't really seen a ticket that I'm like this we won't be able to do this in
This
our
is
existing
novel.
like
Yeah.
because if you think about it, what is a Gumroad customer support person doing, right? You're kind of just building the world model of what Gumroad is as a product, and then just like helping the user do what they want, or saying you can't do that thing, right? Basically. And so in my head, like it's really like contained enough and simple enough that you can, in the current context length of like what is it, 32,000 now, it's completely doable. I think that the hard thing, the thing that companies struggle with, and I've invested in a bunch, and I think that the mistake, or like I don't know how you overcome this, is you just don't have real production. You need customers, right? You actually need. The problem is like people are building all these things, and you can like integrate a chat box on your website and all these things. Great, but what you need is Gumroad. You need 6,000 tickets a month.
Yeah.
Like real data. Because the thing is, those edge cases are real, and like it is annoying. Like and it's sort of chaos theory. Like you don't really know what the edge cases are. You make a list of all the edge cases, and then all the edge cases are not on the list of the edge cases that you made. Right? It's always like they're always one step ahead of you. And so I think it's basically like the plan is to just sort of like kind of like just work through that Pareto list, right? Of like the top tickets, get every single one of them until it really like basically the goal is that I should be able to on my phone swipe like Tinder swipe my way through Gumroad support. Like it should be that easy to just go through. And then maybe there's like 7 tickets left to get escalated to like the team, right? And that there's real work of like answering
Yeah, I
these
mean, it's
manual.
at a certain point you run into like diminishing returns of like, if
Yeah,
Gumroad AI can handle 99.999% of tickets, like the next nine isn't going to help
exactly.
you. So
And I mean, this is why the hourly rate is so important. The hourly model is so important for me, right? Is because it actually, the problem is the incentives don't align in most companies because you
I was going to
have a
say, do
bunch
you
of
worry
people.
about disincentivizing people to automate their work?
I mean, I think in this case, I tell them the same thing I tell them about Gumroad and Flexile, which is we'll just build new products.
Yeah.
We'll just have more, like and I believe this generally about the economy, but I just think like if you want a job, there'll be a job. You might have to create the job, but like it might be a harder job. It might be a more creative job. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, and this is one of the nice things you get when you hire people for $75 an hour or $165 an hour, and you hire remote, so you're hiring really amazing people. Is you can sell them on stuff that someone who's like some high school kid getting paid $15 an hour like doesn't really give a shit about, right? Like whatever.
Yeah.
But you can say, hey, you're getting equity in the company that gets you dividends. That dividend is going to be in perpetuity. You can do the math on how much money you're going to get on top of this. You could even stop working for Gumroad and get that dividend. Uh, and and then like there will be interesting products that we will build. Um, but yeah, the existing job that you currently do at Gumroad will not exist 5 years from now. If you're a software engineer at Gumroad, it won't exist. If you're a product designer at Gumroad, it won't exist. If you're a customer support person at Gumroad, it won't exist. Uh, and certainly that's true for the CEO of the company, right? Because I'm constantly being like, oh, this is dumb. Why do I do this? Hire somebody, automate, outsource, right? Build a SaaS product, buy a
You
domain, right?
shouldn't
Like
want it
I'm
to be the same theoretically, right? Like if you're doing the exact same thing that you're doing today 5 years from now, like
Well,
that's nobody.
the reason you don't want it to change is if you are salaried, because what happens if there's no work to be done and you just get fired, right? Like the
Right.
unique thing that I have that nobody else has is I know I'm not going to get fired. So I can go on Twitter and be like, I worked no time today. Haha, cool. Amazing. Software's awesome. An engineer does that, they get fired, right?
Well, I was gonna say,
And
and you can do
so
that without like so when you're saying that, I'm just like switching that into my world. Like I don't think I could get fired. I probably wouldn't, but it would make everybody really mad at me. And like it would destroy morale and work ethic of the company instantly. But for you, it's because the assumptions coming in are so different. Like that's fine.
Yeah, and I think it's that's the reason you joined this company and you work on it in this way is you're excited about this vision of the future in which you can work, you can earn equity, and just like every rich person on earth, if you earn enough equity in a business that's producing dividends, you can retire. You can
Well, that's
stop
that's
working.
the other really interesting thing in the equity piece is unlocking dividends completely changes what equity means, right? Like
Yeah.
when most Silicon Valley companies give employees equity, it's really, and it's not subtle, it's options in the event of a liquidity event. It is very literally, hey, if we get bought or go public, you will make money.
Yeah.
Um, whereas, and that's not the way equity is. Equity is ownership in a company, so theoretically it would be, hey, get to you own a piece of the company. But in most Silicon Valley companies, that doesn't matter until there's a liquidity event, because that's the only way you're getting anything out of it. Or I guess you could sell it in secondary, but like I said, it's just so abstracted from that. When you give employees equity in Gumroad, it's actually an annuity of sorts, right? Like you're actually, I mean, it's all it very literally is just a profit share that you're giving out
Yeah. The,
to
the the
shareholders.
difference is that it doesn't go away when you get terminated, which is the
Right.
case of all other forms of profit sharing, profit participation units. They all go to zero. They're effectively all bonuses. They're all, again, incentives for you to work. Whereas what I'm doing is trying to create an incentive for you to not work. It's to work enough so that you build up an equity position that you can quit, right? And like, so imagine the goal is to do about, I think we can get to about a 6% dividend rate based on the $100 million valuation we raised in 2021, which means, let's say, $60,000 is what you need to earn to live, like a baseline living, right? And then you have freedom and choice. Like you have to do about $1 million worth of work for Gumroad, which as a software engineer, you could do in 4 years. So in
Hmm.
theory, you can work for Gumroad for 4 years as a software engineer and retire anywhere in the world.
And live on
Like
the
that's
equity.
and live on the equity, like literally live on the dividends,
Fascinating.
or sell it or whatever. But like, and it's sort of like, yeah, like I don't know, like creating this opportunity for people who are like maybe Peter Levels or Dan, like these kind of indie hacker, solopreneur type people who maybe just like don't have that their own MRR yet and are need someone else to. They're borrowing Gumroad's MRR for a bit, right? I think it's potentially like just like a really interesting opportunity. And then the other thing that we haven't really talked about is like what does this actually mean for like talent worldwide, right? Like
Totally.
people have been moving. Like immigration exists mostly in search for higher salaries, right? That's the majority reason for immigration. Maybe refugees are higher, but generally my parents moved from India to New York to like get mostly to make more money via higher education, etc. But what if you didn't need to do that, right? Like what if you could just earn like what would I have stayed in Singapore? Like what does that mean for taxes? What like how does like what does that mean for countries? What does that mean for like marriage? Right? People move to cities, and then often that's where they meet their spouse and partner. Um, Obviously, you're seeing like commercial real estate is suffering a lot, right? They're down a huge amount. Um, uh, but yeah, I mean, cities are also, on the other hand, more compelling than they've ever been because people can work remote. They're moving to New York. Like more people are moving to New York because they now can live in New York and they weren't able to before. So
Right.
there's that sort of Pareto of cities happening too, which is like this sort of like second order effect that I think is surprising to some
What
people.
kind of
Uh,
decoupled like live to live and live to work for some people, not everybody. And turns out I mean, parts of San Francisco got decimated. Parts of like, before COVID hit, we were living in the East Bay in Danville, which is one of the most lovely communities in the world, and everything, was propped up because it is close enough to San Francisco that you can still have like the idyllic little community, and then painfully get to San Francisco every day. But then when COVID hit, prices went through the roof because now you can just live in the idyllic community and not have to commute to San Francisco anymore.
yeah.
And I thought that was fascinating. I mean, obviously, I'm ascribing an entire economic trend to a single thing. I'm sure there was more at play than that, but the bifurcation of live to live and live to work has been fascinating to watch.
Yeah, or even just cars, right? The primary function behind the car was a commute. I mean, that is the primary function even today. So what happens when that slowly, I mean, it's great for climate change, you would think, right? I mean, there's like positive things too.
Has to be, yeah.
Um, but yeah, it is like this very very. I mean, I feel like I notice it in the behavior of like I use Uber more to bring things to me than I use Uber to go places, which is like weird. Uh, And so I
Yeah.
don't know. Like I think like migration, because I don't need to leave my house to get to work anywhere. Like I just
Yeah.
like if I'm working from home, I actually want stuff brought to me.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's all sorts of like really interesting sort of like things that will happen that I think people haven't really considered yet. Like I think about like what happens when there's some Gumroad person like in some place that's made 4 million bucks in their little community, where 4 million bucks literally means you are the richest person in the city. You are literally like, does that mean
Oh
you
yeah.
become mayor? Like, does that mean like what is that? I don't know. I don't um it's very yeah, it's very fascinating.
How
But I
much of
do think it's
Gumroad
it's it's yeah.
is outside of the United States from a part-time employee base?
Most probably 70-80%
That's
is
what I would
outside the
guess. Yeah. But the
Yeah,
other
so
the
we
other
have
fascinating thing about so we were kind of a third remote, and then we had an office in San Francisco and an office in Utah. But the bigger shift of COVID for us is we started hiring folks more internationally, and like the what you can so yeah, there are different salaries you can pay in different locations, and different amounts of there's like a I find that people often say like, oh, you should get paid the same amount for the same work, and I get that I get why people want that to be true, but in reality that's not how labor prices have been historically set really ever. It's been supply and demand, and there is a supply and demand for a software engineer in San Francisco, and there's a supply and demand for a software engineer in Ohio, and it's not because of the cost of living necessarily that you can pay one less than the other. It's because it's a fundamentally different market. Um,
Mhm.
and it's been interesting to watch that. It's going to sound so trite when you actually say it, but like there are people for whom an amount of money that in the US would be like not even noticeable is like, oh my gosh, life changing. Like there are places where if you pay 50K, it is mind blowingly incredible for people. And then in San Francisco, I mean, there 50K isn't a thing. It literally doesn't exist, right? Because you can't
Yeah.
afford to buy anything making 50K. Um, so
Yeah.
that was somewhat anticipated, but the other thing that I didn't so much anticipate is the shift in like if you take somebody in a very rural area who is you're paying them 50,000, they are so much more they can be so much more loyal, and like then you can hire all the best software engineers at in San Francisco, and Coinbase is down that road, and Salesforce is down that road. So I've
Yeah.
really appreciated that giving opportunity to places where there is less opportunity makes so much financial sense and builds a level of loyalty that you just cannot create in hyper competitive markets. I think that that
100%.
is that is understated in people talk about the money, but they don't talk about the like actual life circumstances and the relationship with that person and what that means. I think that's
Yeah,
been
totally. And to your
I'm
point
sure
about
you've seen
waste,
it
I personally think it's a lot less wasteful, right? Because if you're paying someone if you can do the job in San Francisco and in Bali, you should probably do the job in Bali. Just because like it's less energy is being used. I mean, it's like let the real estate go to somebody else who needs to be in that place, right?
sure.
Um, so yeah, I mean, I totally and you're totally right. I think people sort of assume maybe that like full-time work means you stay longer and contract means it's like shorter. We've seen exactly the opposite. Whereas if you're in San Francisco, people leave every 2 years
Yeah,
because they're trying to find the unicorn, right? They're unicorn chasing, and there's nothing wrong with that, but sometimes it hurts a little bit, I guess, but it is what it is, right? Whereas if you hire someone who's like the best engineer in Hanoi, that like where are they going to go? I mean, and if you think about it, how often do people actually change jobs? The main reason you change jobs is because you're moving a city. Like that's
Yeah.
literally it. That's actually the main reason people change jobs. They're like, oh shit, like my wife's moving here. I need to move with her. I need to go apply, right, for jobs. I mean, when I talk to people who are applying to Gumroad, that's like a lot of the reason. They're like, I need a remote job now because we're leaving X, right, or whatever. Uh, so I'm like, yeah, what if you don't like in theory, like these people working at Gumroad today, I mean, I mentioned Steve, who's been at Gumroad since 2013. Basically everybody at the company's been around now since like 20, since they joined. But basically nobody leaves. The truth is like even the people with kids don't leave. Guess what? If you're working at Facebook 70 hours a week or whatever, and you have a kid or two kids, like, the truth is most people quit, right? And
Yeah.
my guess is there's a bias gender wise to who quits in that situation. At
I
Gumroad, I'm
think
not
that's a
saying it's
guess. I think
perfect.
that's empirically shown. Yeah.
Yeah, you'd hope at this point. But at Gumroad, I mean, it's not perfect, but we have lots of new parents, and many of them are moms. I was maybe not say many, right? But like three out of, or two maybe right now. Uh, and we have a couple dads too. But they're not working 40 hours a week for us, right? They're working 10, 15, 20, and they're
Yeah.
able to do. Not to say they should. I'm not making any judgment on how someone should live their life, but the option that they can, that they don't have
Right.
to go to zero, and take a break for a year or two or however long it may be. Um, and I think that's a cool choice that can exist, right?
Yeah.
And
Well, and for
I
you,
frankly
like,
think like if there's not enough work for these people, but they're good, like let them do the work that is necessary and just be honest about, okay, it's 3 hours of work a week. We need like a phenomenal person who I don't know knows Percona or something like that. But we only need you like an hour, a week. Let's just pay you for an hour a week. We can, and by the way, for Gumroad, we can pay you $500 an hour. Like
right.
it's nothing for us, and like so it's great for you. It's great for us. It's great for our investors who are getting the dividends in the at the end of the day. And that's the hope. The hope is to basically say it's about the dividends. And like, this thing that no one thinks about. It's about the dividends because if you can get people to think about the dividends, then all of a sudden people are now thinking about cash flow. They're thinking about how to stay lean. They're thinking about maybe I don't need to work today. Maybe I should just take the day off.
Mm.
Like there's no, um, but the incentives have to exist for those behaviors to happen. People aren't going to go out of their way and just like work extra hard because they're bored. Most people
Mm.
will scroll TikTok or Twitter in my case, right? Like
Right.
I work on Gumroad. Guess what? You're right. Like I don't need to work that hard. I work, probably a few hours a week is what I need to do. But I think about it a lot. Why? Because I own a good chunk of the company. And
Yeah.
so, I'm highly incentivized to make it worthwhile, but probably through dividends now, right?
Yeah, well, and I know we've got to jump because I know you're chatting with some Bloom Tech grads here. Which, by the way, thank you for doing that.
Nothing
But
to do.
the interesting thing about the way that you're doing it and productizing it is theoretically that right now I was thinking through the labor market piece, and you're kind of an employer of I don't know very many places where if I'm a software engineer and a new mom, I can go choose to work for 10 hours. That's not a thing. So you kind of have a monopoly on that market, which is cool. But then like and the dividend thing, I don't know of any other company doing that, but you're also building the groundwork of enabling other companies to do the same. Like theoretically, if it goes really well for you, then you could make it easier for not just Silicon Valley companies, by the way, but for any company to give like actual equity and therefore dividends to employees and start compensating in a way that it feels even more real to me than a lot of Silicon Valley equity, because Silicon Valley equity is like the stock price is that and you sell it once and you juice it and it's gone and like you sold it, that's it. Where if dividends are being paid, it can become a recurring like lifestyle enabling payment, not just a one time, hopefully massive lump sum. It's super
Yeah,
interesting.
like it's like owning, I would like to think that it might be like, owning Costco or Coke or Apple or something like that, where, I think it's a great company. We'll grow, we'll build stuff. You're at the end of the day betting on a software company that employs software engineers and designers to build, highly scalable software. So there's still that bet. But yeah, you're getting, between 3 and 6% a year back. uh, and that's sort of a way to build wealth. And I would say maybe 20, 30 years from now, imagine, let's say there are thousands of companies. I think this will just be like real estate, where it'll just get
Yeah.
wrapped up in funds, and you know just it'll get, most people will not have exposure to it directly. They'll buy like a portfolio of like every Thai restaurant in Portland or whatever. But I think at the end of the day, the trend is that basically like resources turn into capital. That there's just like all of these assets
Right.
that people may want to own, and if you allow people to sort of buy and sell them, uh, just sort of efficiency, wealth is created, right? And that's teaching people skills. That's any of these sorts of things. But I think that's sort of like that's guaranteed, right? That you just make it easier and cheaper, and sort of people may do something with that.
When yeah, and to continue that analogy, like if you look at real estate, real estate that's zoned for rental income trades at a higher price than real estate that's zoned for purely ownership and is more difficult to sell, or, which is worth more than a leasehold property or whatever. So theoretically, by enabling the dividends, you actually make the underlying instrument more valuable because it becomes, that's one of the nasty things about investing in startups is you write a check and that company might crush it, but sometimes secondary markets open up, but you might be sitting 10 years before you can even, have the chance of making any money. And even then, it's usually at the willingness of the founders or board or whatever else. But
Yeah,
anyway,
I mean, think about the companies that issue dividends. You're basically like, this thing is going to exist
right.
for when is Costco going out of business? Like hundreds of years from now? Like when is Procter and these businesses are being run to be run for centuries. I mean, they're
Right.
insanely efficient machines. Yeah, their margins aren't insane, but like they're issuing, massive amounts of cash back to investors. This is how most of the people in the company get compensated anyways, via their bonus. And so this is just like, I joke that this is late stage capitalism, is dividends. Like once you get to late stage, you're at dividends, right? That's kind of the end state, and you can keep making investments and bets. But like unless you're like, and this is honestly, I mean, this is part of why it happens. Like unless I'm really able to invest the capital I have on my balance sheet, I should give it back to my investors to put in T-bills, because
Yeah,
that's like the rational thing that most people, like if they
that's how it
could
should
say
work.
it, would
If
say it.
you're
Like
able
most
to
people say
admit that there's nothing
T-bill.
better you're going to use the capital for, you should be giving it back. And yet we've got Apple with ungodly amounts on its balance sheet that I'm sure they have it in T-bills, but
Yeah. Yeah, I
or
mean, sure, I'm sure they do, but like, yeah, it's all this money that, what if that money could go back, and
if you're not
I
using it,
really
let me
believe
use
it's
it.
wasteful. It's
Yeah.
massively wasteful because it's not being allocated efficiently. It's not being allocated to the houses that would get bought, or whatever, just whatever economic activity. Um, and I do think there's tax reasons not to do dividends, right? You do QSBS, you get free, tax
For sure.
free, up to 10 million. Like their taxes on this is I'm gonna give half to the U.S. government. It's gonna be wonderful. But my feeling is maybe doing it will change the law. Like maybe it'll become more appealing, and then the network effects can go the other way, where it's like all of a sudden the government's like, hey, wait a second. Like if we don't
Yeah.
want this Ponzi scheme to keep happening in our financial markets, maybe we just like make dividends really cheap and make buybacks really expensive. I don't know, whatever.
Yeah.
But these things are up in the air. They're debated all the time. People in government are pretty competent. I believe if they're again just like controlled by incentives like everybody else. So if you can sort of show people like, hey, if you do this, all of a sudden you have to be bought in for the next 30 years, right? Um, Costco's not playing any short-term game. They can't.
No.
I mean, they
No,
can't.
no.
They're not optimized for it. Their investor base isn't optimized for it. And so Gumroad, it's sort of like a lot of people don't want that out of Gumroad, right? They want like a 100x in 10-year bet, and that's what startups do. But yeah, what if the truth is Gumroad's not a startup. That's the simple nature of the beast. It's not a startup. It looks and it's like it looks and acts like a startup. It started as a startup, but at the end of the day, it's no longer a startup. It's profitable. It does 10 million bucks a year in cash flow. That's
Hey,
like
maybe it can
60
be
full-time
both. There's
engineers. I
nothing that
can't. What do I
precludes
do
it.
with that?
Yeah.
What do I do
All
with
right, we
that?
got to
And
stop
the
so we
funny
can.
thing is, if Flex Isle didn't exist, literally the answer would be I would have to make up a reason for not giving it back to investors. I'd be like, I literally like it's impossible. The software doesn't exist. It's kind of a pain in the ass. We raise money from crowdfunding, so if I give it back, I have to give it back to them.
Right.
And like I literally just make it up. I just be like, oh, we're now like shipping Gumroad like this, and we're hiring software engineers because that's what I have to do. And guess what? That's the behavior of a huge
Most companies.
a
Yeah.
huge number of companies, right? At the end of the day. So
Awesome. Well, we're gonna get you chatting with some Bloom Tech grads. Thank you
yeah, I'm
for I
excited to
could
talk to
talk
them.
for 4 hours, but we'll have to catch up again sometime. Thank you.
Sounds good. Sounds great.